Welcome to another episode of Grief Talk. Everything you want to know about grief and more. I'm your host, Vonne Solis. As an author, life transformation coach, online instructor, and bereaved mom since 2005, I'll be bringing you great content that is informative, inspiring, and practical. Whether you have suffered a loss or other adversity, stay tuned and tapped in as I cover a variety of topics to help you get where you want to go on your journey to heal and grow. Today's guest is Dawn Jarvis, known as the Diverse Nurse, founder and CEO of Dawn Jarvis Limited. She is a diversity and inclusion strategist, international speaker, executive coach, author, founder of the Diverse Nurse Network, and creator of the Dawn Jarvis Show podcast. Dawn helps executives, organizations, and individuals implement strategies and best practices to transform strategy into action. Welcome, Dawn. I am so excited to have you to the show.
Hi, Vonne. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you for having me on. I'm really pleased to be here.
Great. So you and I could talk about so many different things. And Dawn and I, for my audience, listeners, and viewers, met last year in the business world, and I immediately clicked with Dawn. And she has a wealth of experience, some of which we're definitely going to be, touching on today. But not only in her professional world, which is in healthcare in the English system, British system, and she'll correct my language, I'm sure, as we go along. Dawn also has some fantastic, I wouldn't say fantastic. Let me rephrase this: in-depth experience with bereavement. So the conversation I want to have with you, Dawn, to help the audience, because my goal with this Grief Talk podcast is obviously to try and get more voices than just my own, talking about topics that we might not even think about as related to grief. And then my job is to sort of spin that and see, from my experience at nearly 17 years as a bereaved parent, how I can use that information to help myself and my audience, obviously, in the mainstream world. So here we go. And with you, I wanted to start with something. I did a little digging on you. And
wow.
No, I'm just here kidding a bit. But I did find, and I'm going to actually read this a little bit as a quote because I can't always remember things. But in your LinkedIn profile, you describe yourself as someone who is really passionate about engaging your community about their health care and educating them about health inequalities and helping aspiring healthcare professionals move into senior leadership positions while remaining true to themselves and their values.
Yeah.
Now, and that's just so wonderful. And beyond that, so I wanted to start that off as the context for our discussion, because I'm going to be moving a little bit into, I know you're a specialist in diversity and inclusion, and I know a little bit about what you've done. I've seen you speak a little bit online, and your world, which you can discuss in whatever terms you want to discuss, your world related to diversity and inclusion, does cross some lines with my world living as a bereaved parent. And so I'm always looking for these, these sort of segues into, well, that's how I feel, even though what I live with is not necessarily visible and but very painful, and there are many limitations that bereaved people, especially coming from extremely difficult bereavement, live with, that makes them feel like they're not part of the mainstream either. And so it's within that context I kind of wanted to ask you. This was going to be my second question, but I'll bring it up now. I know that you started out saying that you were a very frustrated junior nurse, and you worked your way up to senior executive levels in leadership. And so I was just wondering if we could start off with you sharing some of your wisdom, your experience, and some general tools that you've used over the years for yourself and currently help other people with, to move themselves out of a position of feeling either invisible, not equal, or severely limited and impacted by those limitations. And we can circle back to these kind of, sort of topics, but I just wanted to know if you could sort of start off with an introduction about yourself in that context.
Okay. Really a really interesting topic, and I've seen your writings, and obviously heard you speak, and I think and how you talk about grief, and I think grief permeates all sorts of situations, really, and I suppose from the context of my upbringing. So my name is Dawn. My parents are Jamaican. They emigrated to the United Kingdom in the 60s, met in England and married in England, and had a family. Where I lived was a place where there's not many Black people, and I sort of grew up being the only sort of Black girl in my class, one of two people when I actually went to high school, in a very large school. And I suppose in terms of feeling not seen or not understood, that was quite difficult. My dad worked in an engineering factory, sort of semi-skilled profession, and was very frustrated. Was treated quite badly, and that was very aware of his experiences. My experiences at school was sort of not feeling that, sort of like, European standards of beauty and desirability in sort of all sorts of ways, and low expectations, I think, educationally. I ran away, I suppose, not in a sort of like, a traditional sense, but I got away and started my nursing career in London, which is the capital of the United Kingdom, and thought things would be better, and they were in a way, because there were more people around. But when I say my bio as a frustrated junior nurse, I think it was frustrated in that things are hard. It's hard to be heard. It's hard to prove yourself. You're almost starting on the back foot, and that could be for racism, it could be class reasons, it could be for lots and lots of things, because I have lots of privileges. I'm educated, I was born in England, I'm better off than a lot of people, and I was able to work my way up, but it was hard work and it was tiring. And the loss around that is around sort of like loss of identity, sort of like, I would be termed as a Black British woman. But when I was growing up, I felt very Jamaican, because I grew up in a very Jamaican family, and sort of like in a sort of very European English environment. I didn't know where I was. And I think to sort of talk about sort of helping other people that might feel the same frustrations, I think how I do that, if we're talking about tools and techniques, is thinking about what strengths what you are bringing to the party, what you can bring to the party, being very clear about expectations, your goals, your visions, where you're going, but also being clear that if there are blocks, what are the ways out and what are the alternatives, and I think the most important thing is to find some solace in community, in teams, in sort of like in education, your family, to ameliorate what can be a very stressful situation. I share with you the loss of a very close family member. My sister died of breast cancer when she was 26 years old, and that was very shocking, and that was shocking for me, because I was working in the health profession when that happened, and I'm used to helping, and I'm used to solving problems, and I couldn't solve this particular problem, and that happened 18, nearly 19 years ago, and we're still, as a family, still dealing with that loss and the stress, and it's with me all the time. And sort of, so I feel quite empathetic and attuned to people's loss, and whether that's of identity, of their profession. I recently left the health service, and that was a green period too. I started in a different profession. So there's lots to talk about. I'm sure we can speak about lots.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. And, you know, I felt very close to you when I first met you. Um, Dawn and I met over an online business course, actually. And you can always sort of tell, you can feel like when you're feeling left out, and this, my audience, please listen, when you're feeling isolated and left out, whether it is as a visible minority, whether it is something that you're living with that other people can't see, a mental health issue, grief certainly causes a lot of those types of things. I myself, I will be honest, live with post-traumatic stress disorder. I have been living with it now for 17 years since my daughter's death. People can't see it. When you look great and there's expectations for you to act a certain way, it's a lot of pressure. So everything that you've just talked about, Dawn, obviously briefly encapsulated, it isn't too different from living with limitations, living with a disorder, living with such an unbearable loss. And it is in the context, and you and I immediately, I think, connected when I found out you had a bereaved mom. And I'm like, oh. And then as a sibling, I'm like, oh, wow. Like, what was that like for you? And so basically, I wanted to kind of relate your frustrations that you talk about in terms of the hardships. You don't feel heard, always feeling like you have to prove yourself, the fatigue, the loss of identity, really, really important things. You can relate those to, your struggle in moving up professionally, but I can guarantee you all of those things have hit me as a bereaved parent for sure. And I think proving yourself is one of the biggest things that we are faced with having to do. Related to grief, I'm not 100% entirely sure what it is, but I did want to ask you, we can go circle back to any of those things too, but I did want to ask you, as a healthcare professional first, and understanding these struggles, I'm talking in the general healthcare system. I know some of your work involves wanting minorities, visible minorities, and perhaps others not to be afraid to seek healthcare support. And when we don't feel understood, we stay away from doctors. It's pretty right. We stay away from therapists, or we get mad at them and so on. So living from both sides of the fence, what would you offer to anyone listening to this podcast or watching this podcast? What sort of advice, based on your own wisdom, your personal experience, your professional experience, what can they do to try and get support, to find the tools if they need them from a medical professional, help medical professionals really understand what they're going through, because in a lot of cases, people won't reach out for help because they don't know what they're going through. So I know I'm trying to unpack a lot there, but if you want to speak to any of that in your professional, personal capacity, it'd be awesome.
Okay. So first of all, I would say that there's some responsibility from healthcare providers to have some empathy with what service users are going through. I have a philosophy that if you have to touch healthcare services, that's a crisis, regardless of how major or minor that will be. Actually going to hospital, going to see a doctor, to access any healthcare services is a pretty big thing, a thing that causes great anxiety and thoughts about mortality, all sorts of things. I was for a children's nurse for the majority of my career, although I'm trained as an adult nurse as well. And we had a philosophy of, holistic care, looking at the whole family. So not just looking at illness in a reductionist way, in sort of like a disease, but looking at how that impacts on the family. And that helped. That philosophy definitely helped, and is sometimes that's something that's missing. So I'd say, first of all, I want to say that healthcare providers and the medical profession have some responsibility around that. So it's not all on the service users. I think for me, and the way that I help people, particularly now I'm out of the health service, one of the things I can do is, when you're going through a crisis and that, or you are impacting on health services are impacting on you and your life or your family, it's really important that you don't necessarily take that responsibility on, that you need someone to help you to do that. Because if you're ill, even if you're having a baby, I remember when I had my daughter, my son, my first child, I was quite shocked at how little control I was in, and I needed an advocate to be the person that advocated for me, and I just needed to concentrate on having the baby. So I think it's important to get support, so to get someone to listen to the conversations that you might not be able to process at that time, to write things down if you can, or get someone else to write them down, and also to go prepared. I think, unless it's an emergency situation where that's not possible, but if possible, to read up as much about whatever you're going in for as possible, write things down, because you will forget, because it's a high stress situation. And then go have someone go with you if possible, if you want to, depending on how private it is, but then being really clear. So, I know there's been a lot of training, and I've seen it actually in action for my own personal health issues, that doctors and nurses sort of like, it's really important to check understanding when people access healthcare, because it's a lot of information, and it's a lot of information for me, and I'm a healthcare person. So it's really important that you understand what's happening, the implications of what's happening, how that's going to fit into your life. But I would also say, think about, what health means for you, what's important to you, what healthy is for you, because that's going to affect how you manage your health and your well-being, and whether that's in crisis or just generally. Healthcare shouldn't be about just crisis. It should be about, how you manage your health from birth to death, actually. And I think that's really, really important. So we should be having conversation with children, with young people around their health, throughout the life course, and that's sort of like a public health model.
Yeah, and I'm going to say here, so I live in Canada, and very much like your national health system in UK, I believe yours is government funded, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
It's funded through taxation, yeah.
Okay, and so the Canadian one is too. And while there might be a few private services, the general motto is that healthcare for all, and everybody has access and so on. So that doesn't mean that everybody accesses healthcare, of course, because there are these problems. And bringing this back to the bereavement world, or the world where you feel different, or the world where you're struggling and you really, really don't know what's wrong. Education for the healthcare professionals is so important. And I definitely know in the grief world, and I'm so curious to know if it's the same in the UK, there are a lot of gaps for information that's printed on the pamphlets that's handed out kind of by rote from the doctors, telling you go here, go here, go here, maybe 3 places, I don't know, but not a lot. I mean, there are more resources, but the gaps that there are, such as talking about trauma in grief, PTSD in grief, what grievers actually really need, the reality, and lots of suicide stuff. My daughter died by suicide, so that's a whole other ballgame. But in terms of 2 questions, do you think that in the UK, I know you're out of it, but you were in it a long time, and this is not bashing any system. This is trying to educate, bring awareness, because I have brought awareness to medical professionals who treated me, and it really changed their perspective. In fact, they wanted to talk to me about what I was experiencing and going through. But do you believe there's a gap in resources? And I'm just going to focus for the moment on support for grief, for really tough bereavement? Or do you think that the resources are current, up to date, the professionals are out there, wanting to learning from the community who has the problems? What's going on in the UK?
I think best practice is that you should have a holistic approach, and that includes how you manage end of life. The reality is there's a lack of resources to do something. So on one hand, we know the best things to do, and in an ideal world, you would do them. You would do them. I think this has been compounded by the worldwide pandemic, and there is it's the NHS and probably all healthcare systems are really good at managing crisis and managing illness, and the the NHS are the best in the world at doing that, actually. I would say that, but they're not so good at being holistic and looking beyond. So it's a medical model is about solving a problem, and death is the end of the problem, if you know what I mean. They've done everything they can do, and there's an impact that goes wider than that. But if you are a jobbing nurse, as I was, death is the end of your part of it, really. And that isn't helpful for the people who have to manage it. But that's the reality if it's a purely transactional relationship. If you look at it holistically, and there are services around that, I was a maternity services commissioner and a children's nurse in children's intensive care. So I saw a lot of death and a lot of impact on wider family members of mothers, of fathers, and, with outcomes that were not expected.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were services provided. And I think, what I would say is that people cope with death, particularly if it's unexpected, in very different ways. I think even when I was growing up in the 70s, there was more death about. If people, I used to go to people's funerals of grandmothers, of people. I remember a child. I knew two children who died of heart disease, one died of cancer when I was a child, and I went to those people's funerals. I think we don't talk about death in the northern hemisphere. I think some of the cultures have a more accepting nature about death, as it's part of the circle of life kind of thing. And but I think in sort of Eurocentric communities, it's not really out there, and so people aren't prepared for it. And so I'd say, yes, there's a lack of resources. I would say people know the best practice, but if they're prioritising where they're going to spend money in a tax-funded system, they're not necessarily going to target it on that, particularly in a sort of like worldwide emergency. So there's a lot of work to do. Mm-hmm. And some of the answers are around, as I said before, how do we educate people about, this possibility? How do we, because in a system such as one I work in, and it is the system, some of those things, the impact on mental health, the impact on employment, the impact on other children, relationships, that has an economic cost, actually, which the health service that I worked in is designed to prevent. So there is a cost benefit to actually doing something around that through education and other things. And I think that's the way forward. But however, at the minute, and has been for years and probably will continue until we all become really enlightened, people have other priorities.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you, there's just so much there, and I'm going to be putting a link to your website and all the resources that you offer to help people in various capacities, because you do offer quite a lot. So I don't really want to go down the path. I mean I would, but I don't really want to take up a lot of time talking about necessarily what's missing in all the countries that, in the Western Hemisphere that probably have lack of support based on what I'm seeing to deal with sudden loss, to deal with really, really difficult death. I really love what you said. I can't remember the exact term that you said, but in the medical world, it's to solve a problem, and death is ultimately the final solution if it can't really be solved. And but so getting back to a lot of what I do and I'm interested in is healing and personal growth coming from, really devastating loss, any loss, or anything else that has really presented us with, such severe challenges. We feel like, yeah, there's no hope. I'm never going to get out of this. So I've been in this, sort of stream of work for decades. But the suicide of my daughter changed it when I ended up really diving much, much deeper into a pain I had never felt before and have had to learn to, live with, manage, find ways to heal from. And then, so a lot of that, what I offer is kind of within that, arena, if you will. So one thing I want to go back to a little bit, because I'm all about the tools. I'm all about the perspectives and learning and listening. And what did they do? What did they do? How did they do it? And so I would ask you, was there a defining moment for you, moments where in your early frustrations, from your early frustrations and knowing this is not the way I want to live, this is not the way, where I want to be stuck in my life. And I'm gonna wager that you would agree with me. A lot of people get stuck in their lives, and your work and my work, well, it's different, is to help people get unstuck. So, was there a defining moment? Is there a defining philosophy you live by that helped free you from any limiting thoughts, behaviors, actions that you were taking that you could help other people with, that are down at that bottom,
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it does relate back to the death of my sister, actually, which happened when I think I was 36 years old, and the finality of it actually taught me a lesson that life is short and you don't know when it's going to end, and that you have to embrace every opportunity and do what you're going to do. Whatever you want to do, you need to do it, because that you haven't got infinite time to do it. And I was a fairly young woman when my sister passed, but it's I'm, to be honest, I'm quite a driven person, and but it taught me. I think we were looking for her driving license, we couldn't find it, and it was just, I wanted to ask her where is it, and the fact that I couldn't really sort of demonstrated to me that death is final, and in this life anyway, like, you can't do anything about it, and you can't, those things are unsaid, unfinished, you can't do anything about it. So the reason I say that is because what has been something that's sort of been alongside me since my sister's death is living the life that she would have wanted to live, being inspired by it. And when things happen, because things happen, life's not easy, is to think, okay, so what can I do positively around this? What do I want to do? How can I do it? And if there's an obstacle, what are the ways around it? Because I don't want it to stop me necessarily. Now, that might sound magical and lovely. However, it doesn't stop the fact that my sister's death impacted on my mental health. It made some coping with some things quite difficult. It's definitely had an impact on my relationships and on my family generally. So but underneath that is that it's quite important to me to have a life well lived with no regrets, and that knowing that things could end tomorrow, I guess, is something that's always at the back of my mind. And that when things happen that aren't ideal, I think about what my responsibility is for it, what I can control, because there's some things you can't control, and you need to be at peace with that. And but the things that you can control, what can you do about it? So there's family member I've got a family member who has some mental health problems and a long-term condition. And while I understand that, and I do understand it, I really do understand it, you have to work in your power and deal with what you can do about it. Because if it's limiting you, you have to think, what can I do? Now, I'm not negating, the terribleness of depression or anything like that, but even if it's a small thing, do that, small steps, and that's what's kept me going.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and I did want to ask you only if you want to talk about it a little bit because it kind of helps me and other bereaved moms out there. As a daughter and watching your mom lose your sister, do you have any wisdom and anything you want to share with other siblings that are dealing with that? I think there's quite a secrecy and silence around that. And one of my passions is to try and also help survivors, siblings of sibling death, understand it wasn't their fault. I think there's a tremendous need for surviving children, especially if it's an only child like I have, to feel responsible for the happiness of their parent who becomes such a changed individual. And, it really rocks the family. So obviously not speaking as a bereaved parent because you can't, but is there anything you want to just help? Well, I've got you here. Siblings and children of a bereaved parent, and just some words of advice that would go along the lines of guilt, regret, it's not their fault, and maybe they're trying to do too much for their parent. Like, how best could they support their mom or dad?
Such an interesting question. I really like that you've asked it, and I'll try and answer the best as I can. I think there's definitely survivor guilt, and it's difficult to watch the devastation of your mother. And being a mother myself, I have this fear of losing my own children, probably a hyper vigilant about their health and survival. And I remember when my son was born, I got the fear. I called it the fear about your children, and I took more notice of the news and the way the world was going. So there's empathy with my mother. As I said, I was a children's nurse who worked in sort of a highly traumatic speciality, and to see the impact on mothers and fathers of the death of the child is something that stays with you. And to have that personally, that I know as a professional and also as a daughter that will never leave her, and it will impact on our life for the rest of her life. And it has been difficult sometimes because my mother hasn't accessed the mental health help that she could have done. She has a strong faith system that is very, very helpful to her, but there are some things that in my medical model opinion could have helped more. Sometimes that's frustrating to watch, and I think my advice would be see everything in the lens of a hurt person, and that you can't do anything that's going to make that less, apart from listen and have empathy for it. But like you said, you can't totally understand that, and to try not to take what can be what feels personally. Having said that, it's not, while that could be the reason for behaviors and stuff like that, it's not necessarily an excuse for it. So not to if there's any adverse behavior that has an impact on the relationship, not to take that on. And I'll say that quite frankly, that part of the journey has been not taking that on is to, we all have our own grief story, and while that, it's all understandable, it's not your responsibility to solve it. And I think as a nurse and as a daughter and as an eldest daughter, I have felt responsible for my mother's happiness. And I'm not responsible for my mother's happiness. She's responsible for her own happiness. And me resolving that in my mind has led to, me being at peace with her.
So that's so important for me to hear. And so for you parents out there that may be watching, and hopefully you are listening or watching this, this is so important, because I have rarely been able to talk to adult siblings who've survived a sibling's death, and only then on a very personal level. And all of them said it tore their family apart. And as adults, and looking back, that they lived, and some of these happened when they were children, and many of them, well, when I say many, all of them felt responsible. Let's say I've talked to a handful of people, and if that happened, nobody talked about it. And also it depends on the era in which this happened. But I've largely, in when they were children, a lot of this was happening, say, in the 50s, maybe the 60s. And, they just never really talked about it in their family, and did feel responsible, and didn't think they were enough for their bereaved parent, their living parent. And so this is something I have been very, very conscious of in almost the entire time I have been bereaved, because my son, who was 13 when my daughter died, the very first thing he said to me is, "I bet you wish it had been me." And he said that twice. And one of the reasons, and I had read books from medical professionals, and here's where voices are just so important, Dawn, is because there's not a lot of material out there in books and in support material, and say, well, that's okay. That's normal for them to say that. It's normal to feel like this. And it is to a point, but then they've got to understand, age dependent, that their mom or dad doesn't really feel this way, and they have to learn about their own grief themselves. And so I know, because my daughter's death was a suicide, there was zero support for our son, zero. And he never got the support. In your UK system, I don't know if they have wonderful support. They do have support for sibling death survivors in hospitals when it's related to an illness and a death that occurred in the hospital. And then they provide support to the families and surviving siblings. But in things like traumatic suicide and that, they don't in Canada, and I don't know if they do in the UK. Actually, can you speak to that really quickly?
I think it's the same. I think
okay.
Having worked in hospitals where children died of illnesses, that there would be some psychological support for the families and potentially the siblings sort of built into the service provision. However, not all deaths happen like that, and it's a very hospital centric service,
of course.
And these things come out later. So I don't think that's something that's sort of that's thought about, and I think it can happen, and there are services that do that, but I think it depends on the education and the support given to the families in the first place about whether that will be accessed or even offered. And I think parents who have other children, they're grieving themselves, and that goes back to that you need an advocate to sort of like think these things and think, oh, would that be a good idea? When my sister died, her daughter was 7, and there was help offered, but it wasn't taken up. And that is about the sort of health beliefs of parents, and so sometimes those services are available, but the way people's beliefs about health, including how you live and how you die and what you do around that, can impact on services that are taken up. And so that's what I suppose I'm going to keep going back to that. I think we need to have these discussions.
Yes. Yes.
from a very, very, very young age, because I would say that in my life, people I know whose mothers died when they were young, that has impacted on them. My sister died, my niece's mother died when she was young, and that the ramifications, she's in her late 20s now, but those ramifications
Yeah.
are still there. And perhaps with support when she was 7, maybe things would be difficult. But we're a system of consent, and we trust parents to make the right decisions. So it's very, very difficult, and all any of us can do is make the decisions that we feel right at the time.
Yeah, for sure. And so, again, I'm not going to linger on this topic because the idea for this podcast and all the episodes are to bring about awareness. And if people want to explore ideas, explore coaching, explore books, further help, obviously, the work that you do, the work that I do is available through other resources. This is just like an awareness. Let's talk and what's really happening. I agree with you 100%. I once heard, actually, very soon after my daughter died, was that the two worst deaths were losing a child or a young child losing their parent, one of their parents.
Right. Yeah.
And do you agree with that? Is that what they sort of say? And yeah, and it leaves just such horrible stuff. On a positive note, though, not to stay in the trenches, but we do have to have these difficult conversations because it's real life. And getting back to what we were talking about sort of earlier, in inclusion, in whatever way you feel left out, of the mainstream. And I'd wager that's a lot of us feel left out of the mainstream. And my interpretation of that is you just can't function at the same level, the same speed, the same motivation as sort of people who haven't been touched by stuff. And, I was an A+ personality too, Dawn. And when my daughter died, like, that was no longer the case. And I don't know if you found that. You mentioned you were A+ personality. So did you find that the case, that you weren't A+ anymore, or were you still able to function at the same, speed with the same motivation, or did you sort of have to rebuild yourself to be part of this mainstream?
So really, really interesting question. And it's sort of probably maladaptive coping mechanism. So my maladaptive coping mechanism was to work really, really hard and to be a perfectionist and be busy. And it wasn't until I stopped being busy that I actually dealt with the impact of everything that was going on. So I was avoiding actually dealing with things by being busy and getting promoted, and being really good at my job and things like that, and was sort of not dealing with the matter in hand, which was quite a traumatic thing. So,
and I just want to say that that's so important what you're just saying, because a lot of people who suffer a traumatic loss, that's their go-to. I won't say a lot. I'll just say people may, as a go-to, do exactly what you did. Some are forced to do it. And but if you're left on your own with your thoughts, I mean, how scary is that, right? So I just want to circle back a little bit. I can't be an A+ personality. So there's two little things I kind of want to, in tandem talk to you about here briefly. One is, so did your sister's death, and like you said, you were in your 30s at the time, did it, if she hadn't have passed away, would you have made different decisions in your life about anything? And yeah. And
100%, yeah.
What made you slow down? Can you answer those two things?
So this sounds awful. Yeah.
Nothing's awful.
I might
Nothing's
not have got divorced if well, maybe I would have got divorced, but it would have been later. One of the consequences of my sister dying is that I decided to divorce my husband because I wasn't very happy, and also I pursued a career in management, and maybe I wouldn't have done that if my sister hadn't died, because I needed to earn money so I could survive without my husband. So those things went in tandem. I may never have embraced my mental health or allowed myself to be mentally ill, for want, so to acknowledge my depression. I don't think I would have done that because it was, I suppose, the way we were brought up, it didn't exist, and that wasn't something for our community, really. So I don't think I would have done that. I think
I just want to jump in on that point, and I won't let you forget my other question, which is what made you slow down. I want to stop for one quick second, and when we're talking about our mental health, I'm very, very public with living with PTSD, and there's some stuff I could actually say, and I'll just briefly sort of condense what I need to say. There are money issues that can happen after a traumatic loss, any kind of shift, anything that presents trauma in your life, any kind of loss, job, divorce, child loss, another type of loss, whatever it is that presents trauma for you. And trauma doesn't mean PTSD. You and I both know that. So for the viewers and listeners, be aware when I talk about trauma, it doesn't mean you have post-traumatic stress disorder. It just means there's a trauma that has happened and we react differently to it. At any rate, I wasn't diagnosed until 2014. And it was the cause of so many problems in my relationship, my extended family life, my personal life. I mean, I kept myself afloat, and I did rely on my A+ personality. Just because I relied on it doesn't mean I could actually function the same, but mentally it was there. So going out and having to finally go on a disability, because I did have to return to work, and I did have to work several years, as a matter of fact, and commute and have a part-time business and write my first book. And all of this was sort of happening around, 2007, right through to 2015. And it wasn't until I actually stopped. One could call it burnout. For me, it was just I stopped. I couldn't do any more. I couldn't get out of bed. I went on a disability, and I went on a disability basically for PTSD and heightened anxiety. And I'm not sure how the insurance company really treated it, because I was like so afraid to ask. Like, can you believe that? I was like, what's the nature of my disability again? But I did have to educate employers. I had to educate myself, and and I owned it. I literally owned it, because it was such a relief to finally have an answer for so many things that had been going on in my life that I couldn't explain. And, I talk about this at length in 2 of my books. But so for you saying, and I just want to stop and pause for just a quick second, for both you and I owning our mental health. I don't personally call it mental illness because of the stigma, but I understand that, sure, in my case, I have a disorder, but I like to think that almost everybody has some kind of mental health challenge. So I like to refer to it as my mental wellness. And because I am doing something about it, yes, I have a disorder, but I don't want that to define me. I want the help for it. I want it to be understood, and I want to be free enough to talk about it, because it is the direct result of me not being able to function in the mainstream, like we talked about earlier, the same as I used to, or the same as very often the competitive world asks of us, if not demands of us. So those are 2 key points I just want to get across, to anyone listening, if they feel like they're struggling and don't know what the heck is going on. I also want to, point out that I also thought I lived with depression, and I'm not sure I live with depression or sorrow. And that's another discussion I've started having a little bit lately, because sometimes I just think sorrow and sadness might feel the same, because, but I'm talking only about me. And so for other people, it is quite normal to feel just really bad for a really long time when something really, really awful happens to us. The point is just not to stay there. And so you and I both do work in that and getting people moving and getting people unstuck in various ways. So thank you for saying that that your sister's death opened you up to really look at your mental health, probably opened you up to look at a whole bunch of things, but really it sounds to me like you were claiming you for who you were, Dawn, which is so important and empowering. Because isn't the work you now do really based on empowering other people?
Yeah, and I think that's so important that you could do what you can. So you see, or I see, injustices, things that aren't right, people aren't accessing healthcare, it's not there. Um, and also having done the jobs I've done, I can see why it's not there. And and the inequality of that. And I have lots of discussions with people about, oh, it's all so terrible, and yes, it is. Yeah, it's terrible. And some people protest, some people are angry vocally or quiet. I choose to try and change things through my work and using what we I suppose in the management terms they would call my personal power, my personal power and influence to talk about these things, to suggest change, to be a thought leader, I guess. And make people think about things in a different way, and that's what I see my duty to be. I think that is the legacy of my sister's death, really, is that you've got one life, we are where we are, and you can only do what you can do, but you can do that with intention and positivity and help, to recognize where people are coming from, and what is your knowledge, what is your responsibility, what is your civic duty, what is your personal duty, what's your duty to your friends. And I've re-examined friendships, relationships, marriages, all sorts of things about, so what is the positive intent here, what is happening. And sometimes those things have been sadness, and they have been things that I've had to let go, and there's been grief about that, definitely. And that is hard, but ultimately, and it's taken ages.
Yes.
It's taken ages. Like, as I said, my sister died in 2003, so 19 years ago nearly. And I would say it's only in the last couple of years, so you talk about when I slowed down when I literally couldn't get out of bed anymore. So I had to, there was no choice. And that's what I always coach and mentor people about. If you don't do this, your body will do it.
Exactly.
So that will happen. And the best thing you can do is to prepare for that eventuality. And people have responsibilities. I was a single parent. I had to get up and do. I think what it changed for me is acknowledging that I was in pain and that I needed to rest. And I was lucky enough to have a job where I had sickness benefits and could do that. But if even if I hadn't have had that job, it would have happened. I would have been in a position where I couldn't get off the sofa.
We're so similar that way, right? And I just want to say, isn't it weird when I was pushing myself so hard, and I'm going to say you were too. And I have a soft spot. I just want to say to you and all, again, the audience, that I just have a soft spot for anybody who's lost a sibling. I get it. And I love you guys so much. And I always feel so honored to be able to speak with you, especially when you talk about your feelings. And it's just so valuable what you're sharing, because so many people don't talk. And I know we're going to wrap this up very, very soon here, but I do want to just say we have very similar things we've taken away from our losses. And I'm sure that other people can too, if they look for it. It does start with responsibility. You do have to want that change. You do have to not want to be where you currently are to have more. This is very, very huge. But it takes time. And what I see in you, Dawn, is compassion and empathy. and such a caring soul, and an understanding that anybody that were to come to you and does come to you for your help in any number of areas that you work in would be very, very blessed because of this approach, gentle approach that you have, and not to mention the decades of experience you had in the system of healthcare, where, because I'm a firm believer that a balance of both, okay, over here we have the science, we have the policies, we have the structure, we have the system, but over here we have the compassion, the empathy, the personal experience of going through real trauma. And that puts a whole new spin on everything in order to help people. And that's kind of the gap I think that's missing largely in traditional healthcare, certainly here. People try, and I respect every single person that tries to help, but there's still that little gap where unless you've gone through something, a lot of times it's still treatment by rote. This is what we tell you, this is what you do, you heal or you don't, and we move on. And so we won't dwell on that right now, but that sort of, for me, has been my experience. And so a lot of what I've had to do is take the knowledge, tweak it for the grief world and my own experience and go, yes, but we need to think about this and we need to think about that. And that's where I see the connection between what we both do, Dawn. So I do want to wrap this up, but it's been so refreshing and wonderful to have you here. Do you want to just speak a little bit about the work that you're doing right now and how people can reach you? I'm going to put a link anyways, but if you want to speak about it, your book, I know you have a book, and just what the focus is for you on the current work that you're doing.
Okay, thank you so much, Vonne. And I want to say that you're an inspiration, and I really love you were talking about how you manage your own mental health, and I have seen this. I have seen that you say that you're tired, you're whatever, and you say it out loud, and everybody respects it, and it's definitely the thing to do. It's not the normal thing to do, and but it's so refreshing to see, and I really recommend it. Just just state your intention, articulate your expectations, and say what you're going to do. I love it. So thank you. You have taught me that. So I'll talk about the business. So there's three parts to my business actually. So I am a diversity and inclusion strategist. I work with organizations around, people think about diversity and inclusion, it's the moral thing to do. It makes business sense, and people write lovely documents about what they're going to do in their mission statement and however. So I'm all about, so what does that mean in reality? So my tagline is transforming strategy into action. So I work with organizations around that. I'm a creator. I have a podcast, I have a YouTube channel, and I've written a book called Nurture Your Network. And the reason I wrote that book is I found, both when I was working in the NHS and also in starting my business and getting clients, and it's about making those relationships, sort of seeing, walking in other people's shoes, making the connections, and I have found that to be very positive. That's how I met Vonne, and we work together in doing like collaborations like this. And then the third part of my business is around personal development, and I talked about the death of my sister gave me the impetus to do what I wanted to do. That was to be in a senior level in the National Health Service in England, but also to have my own business. So it's I firmly believe that you should do what you want to do, because life is short, and I like to help people to do that, to set goals and a mission. And I also have a focus of helping people who might want to start their own business, and how they would do that successfully. So that is a bit about me. You can contact me on my website, which is dawnjarvis.com, very easily, and I'm on all the usual social medias. So as Dawn Jarvis, so you should be able to find me.
Yes. And as I said, I'm going to have that link down there. And I did go to your site and I saw it very, very informative. And I see you have a ton of social media links that people can follow you and connect with you. And I'm just so honored to have had this time, Dawn, to speak with you. I know we speak regularly in other settings, but this has just been so special for me to have you, certainly as part of my launch series in this podcast as an early guest, and contributing to the conversation in the way that you did today. So thank you. I look absolutely forward to when we meet again, talk again, and who knows, maybe we'll have an opportunity to collaborate down the road in some joint venture.
No.
Who knows?
Definitely.
We will just let it unfold. But know that I have great respect for you and admiration for everything that you're sharing, because every voice counts, right?
Definitely. And it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Perfect. Talk soon, Dawn. Thanks again.